All right. Well, welcome back to Inside BBI with John and Eric. I'm John McDevitt, and with me, of course, is senior editor of Big Blue Interactive, Mr. Eric Kennedy. And Eric, we are now fairly deep into training camp, heading into the first preseason game. So, kind of let's talk a little bit about camp so far, and we'll start maybe with a lot of the angst for some folks, which would be somebody like Evan Neal, maybe JMS, some guys who need the time on the field have been injured. So let's start with Evan Neal. He's on the PUP list. We really had him as a guy we needed answers for this year. And those questions are going to linger right now. And the longer this goes with him on the PUP list, the less likely it is that we're going to see him contributing anytime soon. Thoughts on him and maybe some of the other guys that we've been a little worried about.
Yes, and welcome to Quest Diagnostic Center, reporting live, as you can see in the background here. The Evan Neal thing, my sense is fans have kind of written him off. I haven't, but I think his season is in jeopardy, barring injury to other players, which usually happens, so we may see him on the field. But the longer this goes, the more likely he's going to start the season on the PUP, which means he can come off it at some point. But unless your offensive line is collapsing at some point, you're not going to make that switch. And the biggest problem for Evan Neal is this. There are a lot of people who have already made a decision that he stinks based on what they've seen on the field. The problem with is that he has basically played a little over a full season. If you add all the games up, it's like 21 or 20, something around there. And at least half of those games, he's been injured. So we haven't seen Evan Neal at full strength. We haven't seen Evan Neal we've talked about this in the previous episode, with coaching that we have a lot of confidence in at the offensive line position. So he's not, I don't think Pete fans are counting on him at this point. I think the bigger concern right now is John Michael Schmitz, who has missed almost all of camp, and they're really counting on starting at center so they can move Greg Van Roten over to right guard, where Stinney's playing right now. So that's more concerning to me right now. I think right now Evan Neal is somebody you're not counting on, and when he comes back, great. But right now it's looking more like a lost season to him.
Yeah, and it's again, we talked about this in previous videos. The big problem that you have with him is the injury that he has is in a part of the body that is really hard for somebody of his size to, if you start getting it. We were worried about, Andrew Thomas, when he had ankle issues,
Yeah.
you're like, oh God, that could be chronic. With Neal, he's bigger than Thomas. And that kind of continual issue. And the fact they really haven't said, like, we knew it was misdiagnosed during last year, dealt with it in the off season, but here you are, and they talk kind of like they felt, well, he should be ready. He's not ready. He's not now. It's like he'll be ready when he's ready.
Well,
So
oh.
no, please. No, go
I was gonna
jump
say,
in.
well, the big problem is and this ties in with what you were saying earlier, that we're kind of well into camp. We're halfway through training camp. Right now, we're halfway through training camp. And before the joint practices, the Giants had three fully padded practices, three out of nine, I think it was. And then the joint practices came up, and which are great because you're fully padded, you're going against another opponent, and you're going more full speed. Last year, Evan Neal missed those practices against the Lions in Michigan. He missed those. So he missed the most important practices last year. He's missed the most important practices this year already. So how does he get better? That's the issue. I was telling my wife how crazy it is with training camp now. When in the old days it was two-a-day training camp, two-a-day practices. You'd have two practices a day, and one of those practices would be fully padded. And you got the sense coming out of training camp, teams were really ready physically to play the season. Plus, you had four preseason games, and the
Right,
starters
right.
didn't sit all of the way they did now. They sat some of the time, but the second and the third preseason games, the starters always played a half, sometimes three quarters, and they just don't do that anymore. So Evan Neal, how is he supposed to get better if he's not practicing against anybody and he's not using the technique and the fundamentals that they're teaching him? So it's not just he's hurt. he's missing games. He's missing the time that he needs to get better at his craft. That's what's concerning to me right now is, um, and the same thing with John Michael Schmitz. They're missing time that they really, really need to get ready for the season and get better fundamentally at their game, actually trying to block somebody. And that's a little bit scary. So I mean, it's really interesting when you look at it. This is the offensive line minus Andrew Thomas is completely new right now. It's four veterans, which makes you feel a little bit better. But we have four new players right now as of today, not counting Schmitz because he's not in there. We have four new offensive linemen who are veterans who are starting right now who were not on the team last year. And that's a huge transition. But based on the early returns, it looks like a positive development so far.
Yeah, and I think you actually you just hit on something that I was thinking, which is we've had upheaval with the offensive line multiple times over the last X number of years. The but the funny thing is though, when we've had that upheaval, we've had a lot of guys that were not even borderline starters. They were like borderline making teams, and we've had to rely on them.
Right.
Right now, we have some upheaval, but we've got veterans. We've got guys that we've signed in free agency to come in that have started in this league and have played at a decent level. I'm not saying they're all pros or anything like that, but it is a big difference from what we have right now to like fans just hoping that, Ty Phillips is going to be able to somehow come in and play, or we were relying on, the fact that we picked up Price from Cincinnati, a guy that they were just happy to get rid of. I mean,
Right.
so we are okay with talent level, at least in terms of experience and talent together. We're not going to get a big drop off where a guy's not going to know what he's going to do. And he might have physical limitations, but he's smart enough to overcome those. Neal's problem, though, is A, he's struggled already. B, you can't, even trying to rehab, you'll never get timing down. You'll never get physicality down. And that's something else, too. The fact that camps are already much shorter. I was just reading a little bit before we came on a Facebook message exchange going back and forth from Louis Sharp, former offensive tackle with the St.
Oh
Louis
yeah.
Cardinals, one of the best, a guy that had battled LT
Yes, he
a
did.
ton, and an exchange of what he was talking about training camp, and Brad Benson, former tackle of the New York Giants, who commented back to him talking about how we used to do two-a-days. We had 6 weeks of grueling camps. We used to have ambulances off to the side just in case people collapsed or whatever during these heavy, just unbelievably hot, hard camps that we would do. He goes, today's camps are nothing like that. And I think that's really affected the play of the offensive lines in general, because that's how you build cohesion. That's how you build that I understand where you will be from the amount of time that we're together. You can only simulate so much. I mean, in
The
reality, it's the speed of the game and the physicality with that speed that's hard to get down. That's why I'm really happy that we have veterans versus some untested young guys that we're just hoping can step in.
Yeah, the highlight of the old training camps, and it wasn't that long ago, but the highlight of the old training camps on two-a-days was if you hit practice when they were doing goal line drills. So they'd be fully padded, full speed, defense versus offense at the 1 yard line, and they hit, and you could hear it. You could be standing on the other side of the practice field, way away from where the action was, and you heard the smacks and the pounding and the yells, and it was they don't do that anymore. They just don't. And the weird thing is, it, no, the injuries weren't there. Maybe they were, and we just didn't hear it as often. But you weren't getting people out with like for 3 weeks with a calf injury, or you weren't getting people out with some other soft tissue injury, or a hyperextended knee or something like that. Now you had injuries. Don't get me wrong, but it just doesn't seem. I talked to somebody once who was friends with Jesse Armstead, and he said Armstead told him that the more you hit in camp, it's like if you had a callus on your hand, like if your hands were getting used to hard physical labor, your body gets used to that. And Armstead was basically saying your body gets used to the contact. And I think it doesn't sound like it makes sense, but in a way it does. You
Right.
adapt, and so I wonder if some of that's missing. Of course, we've talked about overtraining, all that. But to get back to your point, yeah, the offensive line is competency right now. That's the
Right.
thing. Now,
Right.
most Giants fans aren't going to believe it until they see it. And part of the issue right now is Greg Van Roten is playing out of position. I mean, he can play center, but he's really a guard. They really want him at, they really want the Raiders' right side. They wanted Illuminor and Roten next to each other, which was the Raiders' right side, and they wanted now Runyon over next to Andrew Thomas.
Right.
But in order that to happen, Schmitz has got to be in there. Now that's why I'm really worried about Schmitz. They keep saying it's not bad, but it's a shoulder, and that kind of concerns you with with a center. And then he's
Well,
missed so much time.
on top of the fact that he had a shoulder injury last year.
Yes.
So now,
Same
yeah,
shoulder.
you
And it's the
know,
same
now,
shoulder. It's
yeah. So
not the
now
same
you
injury,
you
they
can,
say, but it's the same shoulder.
yeah.
So
I'm a little when they say that. I mean, it's
yeah.
one thing if you go, it's not the same injury. If you break your clavicle, okay, it's
Yeah.
not the same as a rotator cuff. But if it's something
Yeah.
inside the joint, it's the same injury. I'm like, you can call it whatever you want.
Right.
That area is affected. So the fact that he's out, they thought he was going to be practicing on Monday, and he didn't. That's what they had said the week before. We think he'd be back by Monday. He's not, and he didn't practice at all. So yeah, he's concerning to me just because you don't want Jones to have it. We've got enough things. We'll talk about Jones soon enough, but we got enough things with Jones. I don't want the issue to be his relationship with the center.
Right.
So if Van Roten is playing center and he's doing it for another week, week and a half, almost 2 weeks, if for some reason, then you almost kind of have to be like, damn. I mean, do we switch him back out if Schmitz is ready to go, or do we leave it alone because that's kind of how we're going? I think we're a little ways from having to do that, but it is concerning. The shoulder twice now. That can easily be a long-term problem.
Right. And but there's been a lot of interesting things going on at camp. So we've got the offensive line. We've got Malik Neighbors, who's turning out to be the real deal, knock on wood. And of course, Hyatt's starting to look good. So the receivers look good. Daniel Jones, whether you like him or not, seems to be having a pretty decent camp. He had a decent camp last year, but there were the question marks about his injuries and plus his mental frame of mind, given the fact that it's obvious the Giants were looking to replace him at one point. And then on the defensive side of the ball, other than some expected issues that you'd expect to see with breakdowns in coverage because of the new defense, the defense seems to be coming along too.
I think the thing with Jones and I'll always be careful because I'm not going to say anything that's going to completely contradict what I had said before. You and I had a conversation. In fact, you had a different opinion than I did, which was I basically made a statement that, at the end of this year, they're pretty much going to move on from him. And you came back with, well, that's not necessarily true. Kind of depends on what happens this year. And I agree with you. I think you're right. Depending on how well it goes. What I'm interested with Jones, though, last year, you mentioned it, we thought he had a good camp. The problem is what we're thinking is a good camp with the guys that he had, and lots of times it was going against our own players, not necessarily going against the other team. And I always laughed at that, man. And when they're like, oh, the defense is dominating. Well, I hope so. They freaking know the plays that we're going to run. So if you're not recognizing what we're doing, you're definitely not recognizing what other teams do. But if our offense is shredding our defense, then I'm really concerned because, again, you kind of know what's coming other than the play actually being called, but you know what we run and you know the players you're going against. So take that with a grain of salt. This time, though, we have much different talent. I think it's really people are downplaying the amount of talent that we have now, at least potential talent that we have at wide receiver. We have speed, of which this team has really never had at wide receiver. We have multiple levels. And I thought there was something really interesting said the other day when, and I can't remember who was saying it, about the level of the players. They were talking about, we've got Neighbors, we've got Wandell, we've got Hyatt. These guys are all looking to really produce, and Hyatt's really stepped up. And then it's kind of like there was a couple mentions of some other things, and Slayton wasn't even mentioned in that grouping. And I can't remember who was bringing it up. And I was thinking, you brought up kind of some interesting players like Isaiah McKenzie we need to keep an eye on for special teams. I think we need to keep an eye on these guys because they do more than just special teams. Because Slayton becomes a movable piece for us if we need something else and somebody needs a receiver. And long term, he's not the guy who's going to be here. The three younger guys are. And he's a possibility. But at the moment, we can at least go 4 deep at wide receiver. Jones should have a good camp. I'm curious though overall, what's your thoughts on what most people have said? Every time there's a post about this pass was missed, or I see a highlight, and you don't take everything into full context. So, what is your thought on Giants fandom with the Jones practices so far?
I think we're dealing with a shell-shocked fan base that overreacts and overreacts to almost everything right now. So, um, I understand it. I understand where it's coming from. But there are some times when, football isn't perfect. It's not a video game. And, when Daniel Jones throws a touchdown to Malik Neighbors against tight coverage and somebody's complaining that the pass wasn't perfect, it worked. It got there. That kind of thing sometimes I shake my head at. So I think, there are fans that are expecting the worst, and I understand that, and
Sure.
it could happen again. I don't know, but getting back to what you said, I think we have to start realizing, as long as people stay healthy, which is a huge,
Yeah.
huge question mark, there are some very, very talented players on this roster now that other teams would want very much to have on their roster. Before, it was Dexter Lawrence and Andrew Thomas. I don't know even though I'd put Saquon in that category. I still think Saquon was a bit overrated.
Yep.
I think a lot of teams would like him, but I didn't put him in the Andrew Thomas and Dexter Lawrence. But now you got Burns, you got Deontay Banks shows potential being a really good player. Malik Neighbors is looks like the real deal. You've got a lot of young players now that no one's talking about that could actually have breakout years on this team. Kayvon Thibodeau had 11 and a half sacks last year. Do fans want more? Yes, they do. But he took a big jump from year one to year two. And if he takes another big jump this year, you're looking at a potential Pro Bowl player. So there's a lot of talent on this team. Is it enough to seriously compete in the division? We're going to find out. So much of this depends on the offensive line and the quarterback. So, and then the other thing behind that is, again, it's a brand new defense, a completely new defense. How much time is it going to take for them to get caught up to speed, and how much damage is going to be done when those mistakes occur? So people forget when Spags was here, the first two games were ugly. I mean, the Giants gave up, I think, 80 points in the first two games of the season, in the
Oh,
in
7.
the 2007 season.
Yeah, we
So,
started with Dallas. We got and Eli
and,
got hurt at the end of the game,
and then Green Bay, was
and
it?
then Green Bay followed that up,
Yeah.
and we got we were 0
And
and 2, and we have
it was 80 points, and
yeah.
it's like, dear
Yep.
Lord. So I hope it's not going to be that, but again, you're going to see we're going from a man defense to a zone defense, really, and there's going to be, and we saw it in the joint, and we're going to get in that in our other video, but we saw it in the joint practices. There were breakdowns. So but I think we have potential to be a good team. So much of it just, again, it's the quarterback and the offensive line.
Yeah, and sticking right now on the offensive side, then we've got tight end, and it's interesting. People kind of like, first off, why anybody cares about what the depth chart says before the first preseason game. The Giants are carrying what, 90 players at the moment. That depth chart means almost nothing. I have seen it more than once where they bury a guy that they're doing it on purpose. Like, they're not going to say Theo Johnson's the second guy or even the first guy if they feel he's up to there. Why would you? What's the point? Who are you telling it to? Us, to the other teams? They don't need to know that. They know they've got something with him, and I'm really excited. He's probably one of the few people recently coming in at a lower level of the draft. And I think Justin Tuck for me was probably the last one that came in that way, where I'm like, this guy, he can play. Um, so when we look at the tight end pieces, we got Bellinger, we've got Johnson. Now it's a mix of other veterans. Thoughts on where you think so far in camp, how that's gone, and maybe where the threesome, if we just go with three, where that would shake out.
Yeah, it's interesting that the Daboll is supposedly meeting with Theo Johnson on regular basis, and coaching him up. For those who don't know, Daboll used to coach tight ends with New
Yep.
England, and he has said he wants them to watch Gronkowski tape. So the guy that the coach is spending all this extra time with is supposed to be the fifth or fourth string tight end.
Right.
No, don't pay attention to the depth chart, fellas. He's going to be an important player in this team. There's going to be growing pains. It's going to take some time, but they obviously see something in him. It's an interesting group. The thing that's too bad is Lawrence Cager was actually making noise early in camp, and he's missing too much time now too. I think he had a hamstring, and those linger, and that's bad news for him. He was actually making some noise in the first few practices, and I thought, man, maybe I underrated his contribution. So, when you look at the team right now, I kind of look at it like this: I see Daniel Bellinger and Theo Johnson as being the locks. And then, Manhertz is getting,
Yeah.
I think he's going to have a role on this team. So I think the question comes, do they carry four? And I go back and forth on that. And that's going to tie into how many running backs do they keep? How many quarterbacks do they keep? How many wide receivers do they keep? So I would hope they can find a way to keep four. But I think if I was going to put a gun to my head and say, who are your three right now? I think it's the three that I mentioned.
Yeah, I think if they go for, then you're looking at Bellinger from time to time, possibly shifting kind of as a more of an H back into the backfield piece because he's not good on the line, allowing you to carry that fourth tight end from time where you can use them. Other than that, yeah, because our running backs are we don't have a deep crew there. And so if you're depending on what you're going to do, if you're going to keep it really light, who's available that could block? Well, Bellinger could drop back and kind of play the H back role, and he's done it a couple of times already, where he's more of the move guy. Cager's never been a guy that I've ever been overly thrilled with having because he's so one dimensional.
Right.
He cannot block. I mean, he made Darren Waller look like a good blocker. So you can't really have a series. Your third or fourth guy is going to be he's going to be very role specific. And in his case, if he's going to be more the receiver, well, we've got that. Bellinger's kind of that guy. Johnson definitely will fit that kind of a guy. I need somebody who can block. Manhurst is going to be the blocker for sure. He'll be the guy that when we want to go two tight ends and block, and he's going to be on the field if he makes the team. It's very much like the 90 Giants. We had Bavaro's knee was kind of going away, but he was the starter. Cross was there, and Morosco was essentially an extra offensive lineman that we played at tight end to get his role was to block. And I think whoever's going to be that other tight end is that they're there to block. The
Right.
other receivers are going to be at the top.
Right. And that's why Manhertz gives you value as a blocker, and he's a really good special teams player.
Right.
Now, they got Jack Stoll there too, and he could factor in as possibly the
Yep.
fourth tight end. And they'll probably keep somebody like this is a name that most Giants fans are not even familiar with, but like Tyree Jackson is a tight end that was a former quarterback that the Giants got from Philadelphia, and he's actually been making some plays as a receiver with the third string, and he's a guy that they would stick on the practice squad. So remember, teams can call up players from the practice squad, and the practice squads are huge. So
Right. Right.
so they'll have a tight end on the practice squad at least one, and he makes a lot of sense because I don't think teams are going to claim him. Um, so we'll have four definitely if you conclude the practice squad. The question is, are we going to carry a third quarterback? If so, that makes things tighter. Are we going to carry a fourth running back? At some point, it's a numbers game, and you just, they want to keep in a perfect world they want to keep four. It just depends on what they do at other positions.
So we could jump to the running backs right now, but you started talking about quarterbacks, so maybe let's just go there. So we've got Jones, Locke, and DeVito, and I got to make sure it's Tommy, not
Yes.
Danny.
Yeah.
Tommy. Uh, the question of whether we go with two or three, and again the practice squad, DeVito's already kind of thrown this little thing out there. Well, they would be risking, and I find that in his thought, I'm sure that's a strategic move. I'm thinking the Giants, if they're willing to risk it, then they're willing to find somebody else to be the third guy. So I don't think they're going to too concerning there. But your thoughts right now on the way camp has gone so far. We'll talk about Jones specifically separately, but overall the quarterback group: Jones, Locke, DeVito. It's been heavily Jones like related in terms of like information. So we've heard like sporadic pieces of the other two, but your thoughts so far on what Locke and DeVito have done in camp thus far?
Well, you kind of hit the nail on the head. So a lot of fans are really under emphasizing what Daniel Jones has done. I don't think most of us expected him to be full speed at practice from the get-go, and he has been. So
Right.
he came into camp. He wasn't on the pup. They didn't limit his snaps. I thought they were going to, at best, they were going to like monitor him and give him like half a workload and build him up. He's been full go from the start. There's been no competition. Some of us felt, maybe there's going to be, they won't announce it, but maybe this is more of an open job. That's clearly
Right.
not the case. It's his job, and he hasn't been bad. He had a rough start, and he seems to be getting better as practice continues. And again, up to the joint practice, that's where we are right now. So that's all you can ask for at this point. Hopefully the arrow keeps moving up for him. The flip side of that is what you're asking is, because he's getting the attention in terms of the snaps, we haven't heard that much about Drew Lock, and we have heard very, very little about DeVito. So I can't comment on DeVito at all, because we've heard hardly anything about him other than,
Right.
occasional, he threw a touchdown to Tyree Jackson, who we were just talking about, or he hit John Giles in the, 7-on-7 drills. So the real test for the quarterbacks, assuming we don't see a lot of Daniel Jones in the preseason, is going to be the preseason. So if DeVito and Locke look bad or good in these 3 preseason games, that's really going to flavor this discussion. So if DeVito looks terrible in the preseason, you don't keep him on the 53-man roster. If he looks really good in the preseason, I think you've got to consider keeping him, because we got a 1-year deal with Locke, and when Taylor was here, it was a 2-year, but because they got a 1-year deal with Locke, so he may be gone, and we don't know what's going to happen with Daniel Jones depending on his season. So DeVito could theoretically be the only returning quarterback next year if he's on the 53-man roster. So to answer your question, I can't answer your question, because it's going to be the preseason that tells us what will we have at the quarterback.
Yeah, I think the fact that we're not hearing a lot about the other quarterbacks
Is telling.
really, really points to the fact that, I mean, Jones has been the focus.
Yes.
And I'm with you. And because we talked about this, I was really surprised that he was able to start from the get-go. Like that he was able to play. They didn't restrict him. He ran a quarterback sneak. I think it was one of the practices like 2 weeks ago. They talked about, he ran one in. I'm like, I know you can't have contact, but still, guy's coming off an ACL. You're having him run. I'm like, well, that's okay. You clearly feel like he's progressed. How is his camp gone? You and I are not there on the field at camp watching every little thing. We're seeing everything that everybody else is seeing. I think you can read into it any way you want to, depending on the highlight that you're looking at. There
Right.
was one highlight on a deep pass that I thought, okay, that looked a little short. But when you go back and look at it again, it's also the same pass play that somebody else was talking about. What a spin move Brian Burns put on Thomas, and he got in really fast. I'm thinking Jones then probably threw it in a way he didn't really want to at that moment. And you got to take all that into account. I'm not saying he couldn't throw it further. I don't know. But Burns put a hell of a move on Thomas. It was right on him, and he threw the ball. So he got it. My problem, as you know, is the crossing patterns, the throwing behind people. As long as when we see him in a game, and we could talk about game, the Lion game in another video, but when we see him in games and that crossing pattern happens, it needs to be in the body or forward, not behind. The receiver cannot stop, have to turn back or reach back, because then they lose all momentum. And that's been a big problem for him. But someone says, well, he just dinks and dunks. That's what he does. Patrick Mahomes, for a great portion of last year, by the way, people were starting to wonder, did he lose something? Because his receivers were horrible. They were dropping the ball. They were dumping it off because they would get guys open and he picks the right guy. I don't care if he throws 10 yards or less. If he hits the right guy and we're picking up yards after catch and we just keep moving down the field, great. It's the problem becomes when guys are breaking open and then you just throw it to somebody short. That's the problem that we've seen in the past that I want to see go away. But as far as the other 2 quarterbacks, yeah, I think it's going to be all game. I think I don't think your thoughts. Is there even a competition between Locke and DeVito? I don't think so. I think Locke is a lock unless he falls apart.
It's a great question. I don't think so, but I'm basing that on nothing but, again, what they paid him and the fact that he's been getting all the second team reps. So I don't think so. But again, what happens if Locke is terrible in all three preseason games and DeVito isn't? So again,
Right.
I know I'm punting here, pun intended, but I know we really have to wait until the preseason games with the quarterbacks because that's going to be super telling. The one thing I will say, piggybacking on what you were saying about Jones, before we move on, is his early highlights and lowlights from training camp were concerning. Those plays have disappeared lately. So he was overthrowing and underthrowing receivers deep early in camp. He's not doing that now. There was I don't know if he's getting his old mojo back a little bit. I don't know again if it's being coached into him. It's clear that Dable, and maybe we should be giving Shea Tierney some more credit here. He
Hmm.
was the quarterbacks coach who's now the passing game coordinator, but there's an emphasis in this camp at pushing the ball down the field. So there was a funny video this week. Again, I'm prefacing or previewing the Lions camp, Lions joint practice here, but the reporters staying on the sideline with their iPhones and they record this stuff. And one of the reporters saw Malik Neighbors lining up outside at the 25-yard line against man coverage, and the reporter said something like "F and throw it down the field, Jones," or and then Jones threw a pass down the field it was a touchdown. It was one of the highlights of camp and hit Neighbors for the touchdown. But he did that. I mean, so it was kind of a microcosm of fan reaction with Jones. It was like, will you throw the football down the field? But
Right.
there he did, and it was a touchdown because he's got a receiver now that will make the play even on a 50-50 ball. So will that translate to a real game? I don't know, but he did it. So we have to, if you're going to rag on Jones for the negative, you got to give him credit for the positive. And he's been getting better and he's been throwing the ball down the field. Now we just got to see him do it in live games. And part of that's tied in with what you were saying earlier, confidence in the offensive line, confidence in the wide receivers he has, and so we'll have to see. So I just want to follow up on that. So
Yeah.
that we have to see more of that. I hope they play him in the preseason, at least the second preseason game, not just one series. I hope we see some extended play because I think he needs to get that out, get that mindset back.
Like one subject that we all agreed not to speak of on BBI. People get entrenched in predetermined belief or this is just the way that it is with and refuse to ever come off it. And it's one of those things that really bugs me about Jones because there are those and I'm definitely not naming any posters this time. There are those that absolutely don't want the guy. I have a real problem with disliking somebody and actively rooting against them. You cannot like a guy and say I don't think, but then let his play determine whether that belief was true or not true, versus actively wanting him to fail to then justify the opinion you already had. I lost my belief in him, and I was actively wanting us to draft Drake May. I said it over and over and over again. Said it on one of the shows recently. I wanted him to draft May, but I'm not going to be upset or disappear on the site if Jones is 25 of 33 for 325 and three touchdowns and we win by 15 points. I'm not going to like slink away from it. I want that to happen.
Yeah.
Now, the question is, can it happen? I don't know. He hasn't really proven it over a season, even his best season. But some people get really to the point where almost anything good they can find the possible negative. Well, like you said, there was somebody brought up, well, that wasn't a very good throw. And someone else jumped on and goes, you understand that was a back shoulder throw because the safety was over the top. People just like, oh, no, you should have hit him in the hands. I'm like, yeah, get him killed at the same time. Those plays are done on purpose.
But
So
the reverse is true though too, because you got fans out there that never see any wrong. So they're
there,
reacting. So the two sides are reacting more to each other. So it's almost like, again, we're not going to get into it, but it's like a political discussion. You don't see the other side because you don't want to admit the other side because it destroys your argument or
Right.
undermines your argument. So they're not going to admit to the other side, hey, there was a good play, or hey, there was a bad play there. Because it destroys. I mean, but I hate that. Like I hate that way of thinking because you should be able to admit when you're wrong or admit when you might there is some doubt there. So again, I'm not saying I don't want people to interpret this the right way. Daniel Jones is very much career with the Giants is very much in jeopardy
Oh,
still.
absolutely.
He's still
Absolutely.
very much in jeopardy. He's done nothing other than have a few decent days in practice here. So and it means nothing, and we won't even remember this next year. So but you got to acknowledge the good and the bad when it occurs, and we'll react to that. There were some, there are plays in practice where somebody drops an interception that might have been a pick six, and if that wasn't dropped, you have a wholly different impression of that practice. So, and then
Right.
and reverse is true too. A wide receiver may have dropped it or didn't run the right route and didn't get the touchdown on a really well thrown pass, and that flavors the discussion too. So it just works both ways.
Sure. And I'm gonna potentially get flamed for what I'm about to say. And I know it. I get it. I understand where they're gonna come from. Phil Simms was drafted in 1979. The league was much different then. Nobody knows that probably any better than I do growing up in football. I know how completely different the league is. However, he was drafted in 1979. He had a couple of games in his rookie year. I mean, I think he didn't he have one game in his rookie. If it wasn't 79, it was 80. He threw 5 touchdowns in the game.
Yeah.
Ernest Gray had like 3 or 4 of them. Um, Yet he got injured a lot. He struggled. He threw a lot of interceptions. He also fumbled the ball a lot, by the way, too. In 81, he gets hurt again. So here we are in a year that he took them to the playoffs. Ultimately, Scott Bruner finished it in the playoffs. 82 blows his knee out. 83 doesn't even win the job. Bruner's the starter. Comes in, substitutes for Bruner in a game against the Eagles, makes an amazing pass. It was really getting the offense going. And then his thumb slams onto the helmet. I think it was Clyde Pitts, but I don't remember exactly. Destroys his thumb,
Right.
just busts his thumb, bone comes out the side. Done for the year. Goes into 84. So when we talk about Giants were looking for quarterbacks this year, and Jones knows it, people forget in 1984, the Giants were looking at Warren Moon, along with a number of other teams, about bringing him in from Canada.
Yeah.
And so they were not sold on Simms as being the guy. That was not Parcells' guy per se. He was not sold that was going to be the guy. And think about that. That's 79 to 84.
Right.
We're
And
talking
think
19 to 24, same number of years.
and Sims has always been a young looking guy, but he was closer to 30 than he was to 20 when he finally settled down and
Yes.
was the quarterback he was. I mean, I think I'd have to go back, but I think in 85 or 86 he turned 30. It was somewhere around there, I think. But you don't think of him like that because
Right.
he's just always he always when he was a player he looked like a young guy. He always looked like a young guy.
Right. Right.
So but that's the example that the supporters of Daniel Jones love to bring up. The issue with that is Sims flashes when he wasn't hurt were much higher than Daniel Jones's
Sure.
flashes have been.
Sure.
So on bad football teams too, including bad football teams. So, but to wrap this up, we probably should move on to any other positions that
Well,
you
we
want to
haven't
look at.
talked
Yeah,
about on because we're still on the offense, so
yeah,
we haven't flipped over to the defense, but the running back group,
yeah.
which we know Singletary is going to be the starter. I mean, at least that's the way it certainly seems. And then it's kind of a mix of guys who really are either new to the league or certainly have been around a little bit but have never been on a team and contributed. So we've got a lot of youth that we're going to be going with on offense in general. But what are your thoughts overall on the running back group?
Very young, no experience after Singletary, really. So it's interesting, but they don't seem to be worried about it. And Tracy seems to be starting to push for playing time. So he's going to be fun to watch in the preseason. The only thing with him, as far as I can tell so far, he's had 2 fumbles in training camp. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. He's not the biggest guy in the world.
Right.
I think this is going to be a passing team, and the guys that we have can catch the football. So I don't worry about that. I think Eric Gray's got to start worrying about his roster spot because it looks like Dante Miller, his speed is catching the eye of a lot of people, at least us fans and media types are catching it. And so I would think that that's going to be enticing to the coaching staff too. So I think the preseason is going to be very important to somebody like Eric Gray because if they only carry three backs, somebody's got to go. So
Right.
Singletary's going to be the guy. My gut tells me Tracy's going to play quite a bit this year. Whether we see Miller or Gray, I don't know. But I think that's the pecking order right now because it seems like Tracy's pushing for playing time. Is my sense of it.
So I'm sure this will come up when we move over to defense, but for now, for the offense, I would be paying attention to the preseason, and I don't necessarily mean the preseason with the Giants. I'd be paying attention to the preseason across the league. There will be backs that are going to get cut from other teams that are going to be vet backs that might come in. I think the Giants will definitely be bringing a veteran back to be part. You can't go with just a one guy who's a vet and then three young guys just behind him. I think they'll bring in another veteran that they can count on and stash maybe one of the other guys on the practice squad, hopefully to get them through because we cut Corbin injured recently. So I think that's one to keep an eye on. I mean, if somebody like if a Zach Moss were to get cut with his ties to the Bills and stuff, and then that offense, knowing he could be easily a guy that we might look to. But just I think we're gonna go. We'll find a veteran, but we'll
I
see.
think I think this is one of the areas where we may disagree a little bit. I don't think they'll do that if they keep three. They could possibly do that if they keep four, but I think you got Singletary, you got Tracy, and the question is the back that out there is a guy that you want to risk losing Tracy Miller or Gray with. Now remember, this regime drafted Gray. They have a higher opinion of Gray than the fan base does, who's I still think they're basing most of their reaction to him on the kickoff returns
Yeah,
that
yeah,
he had
yeah, yeah.
last year.
Agreed.
Um, but this is a really important preseason for Gray. If Gray looks very pedestrian this preseason, his job is in jeopardy. And that then your scenario where they may pick up a veteran comes into play right now. So I'm not really sure. I still get the sense that they're going to pick up somebody and this get on the defensive side. It's going to be on the
Sure.
defensive side of the ball. Still, I'm not really sure. I just don't get the sense the running game is going to be all that big to this team this year. I think they're going to run the ball, and I think they're going to throw to the running backs. But I think this is going to be a Neighbors, Hyatt, Wandale, Robinson offense. That's just my feeling, and that's one of the reasons they got Singletary because he can catch the ball. Tracy can catch the ball. They got Theo Johnson. I think this is a passing team right now. That's just my sense.
Yeah, and I agree that I do think it's going to be a passing. And we did talk before the short passing game does become in a way a kind of a de facto running game. If you could just dump it within 2 to 3 yards and then have them use the run after catch to gain that yardage to pull things away, that works as a portion of your running game. So you could be right. I just have a feeling that one of the biggest problems that you can have is pass pro. And if you don't have a guy that you really trust, you don't have a veteran that you can trust to put back there in pass pro, are you going to count on two of the younger guys who've never done it in the league? We'll see. But let's switch to the defense because then let's go back to front since we are already talking about possible pickups. Overall, we've heard a lot coming out about the secondary. Banks his job is his job. He's the guy on one side. We're kind of questioning where we are in corner, so we'll get to that. And then the safeties, one of the big things that came out was like, well, some guys can't really. We've got all this talent with a guy, but we can't see it if he's not on the field. So Newman was missing a bunch of time, but now he's back. But it looks like Belton and Pinnock right now are kind of the guys at safety. Thoughts on the secondary, and let's start with the guys we know, and then let's go to the cornerback position, which we kind of don't know yet.
It's going to be a very, very young group and a group that's learning a completely different style of coverage. So there's going to be mistakes, and people are going to, again, I hate to use the word again, overreact. It's just going to happen. When you have young players and you have a new defense, mistakes are going to happen. You're going to see somebody running wide open, and at some point, it's going to cost them a game or two, with these breakdowns. But I like a lot of the players that they have. And you want to do safeties first? Or you want to do the whole group?
You just do the whole group. Do the
Okay.
whole group.
So obviously the big question is at corner opposite of Banks. So the nickel spot looks like it's getting locked down by Andrew Phillips, very young rookie, very young player. Banks is still a second year, very young player. The other spot is the one everyone's a little bit worried about because they don't, the Cordell Flott has the first shot at it, and he's been up and down. It looks like Nick McLeod's starting to press him, and of course there's a growing sentiment among fans that they need to bring in somebody else. That's easier said than done. There is a veteran or two still out there, like Gilmore, I think, that they can look at. But that's the question mark in the secondary, other than youth, is who's going to knock down that corner opposite of Banks, and it's anybody's guess at this point. So I think it wouldn't surprise me if we see somebody like that people have completely discounted in the past, like a Darnay Holmes, who was playing nickel, who's now playing outside. If push comes to shove and everyone's struggling, I wouldn't be surprised if someone like Darnay Holmes is given the shot at some point down there. And then Trey Hawkins is still on the team. So we'll have to see. Again, preseason will be very telling, but that's the one spot that I think they're going to be scanning the waiver wire, maybe even a trade at some point. We'll have to look at that. The safeties are really young. I mean, that's another really young
Right.
group.
Right.
And this could have gone badly for the Giants in this sense, is that the coverage schemes in the secondary are so different than what Wink Martindale ran that Bowen could have come in and said, Pinnock and Belton just don't fit my scheme. And we could have been in real trouble. And I kind of was a little bit wondering, is that one of the reasons why they got Newman, is because they've got to start all over. The good news is he seems to be so far pleased with Pinnock and Belton back there. Belton's actually, I get the sense Belton's kind of surprised him because he has very nice things to say about him. And so Newman, which is great about him, is we know Bowen loved Newman in the draft, but now they can afford to actually bring him along a little more slowly rather than force feed him into the lineup. And if they do need to force feed him, if somebody fails, they've got him. But
Right.
they don't like last year. They had to play Banks. They had nobody else. They had to.
Right.
Deontay Banks had to play. This year, Newman does not have to come in there and start, which is great. So I actually like the safety group. Again, it's very, very young, but you got even like Javarius Owens back there.
Mm-hmm.
They picked up the safety from Pittsburgh, Riley, who's been actually getting a lot of second team reps until he got a concussion this week. And he's kind of flying under the radar too. So I like the safeties. It's that one corner spot. And we know from Hard Knocks, they know they have a problem at the other corner spot. So
Right.
now there's an opportunity here for someone to nail it down. Whether they do so, I don't know.
Yeah, so on the safety side, the Newman thing didn't really surprise me per se, just because you lose McKinney and Belton hadn't really, he's at that point in time, he hadn't stepped up. He hadn't
Yeah.
moved into that. He got injured a couple times, so he was never really out there. So you couldn't count on the fact that he would just be the guy. So, but I think they're young, but I think we're fairly deep enough that I don't think you have to go find somebody. I think Pinnock is the veteran. You got a couple of these other guys. Belton's been around for a couple of years. Newman, and I think Owens will probably make the team. I think you're going to be okay at safety. You can mask a lot at safety with scheme. The corners are a little bit different, even in scheme, because the other side right now is completely up for grabs. I like Flott, but I just worry that he's physically not capable of playing down in, down out as the starting corner. I think he can come in. I think he can play off coverage a little bit. He's a thin guy. He's never going to be very big. He's going to be a liability in the run sport. So where you can mask that stuff with the pass rush, you can't do it in the run game. So if he can't support, that's a real problem. And if he struggles in coverage, which is so far he hasn't lit it up, now you're kind of 0 for 2. And now what are you going to do? I think you're going to scan the waiver wire. I definitely think that's the possibility where I think they could pick up a running back. I think they very well could trade to get a corner in here, a veteran guy who maybe another team's kind of like, if we can get just a 7th round pick for the guy before we just cut him, maybe we'll do that. I think you want a presence. Maybe they're not as talented, but you need a guy that I know is he'll know what to do And I'm not so sure that you got that with any of the other pieces that we have out there at
Yeah,
the moment.
and they wanted that at safety too with Jalen Mills, but he's missed all of camp too with a calf injury. So,
Right.
he was kind of one of those guys you would have thought would have definitely be on the 53 as the veteran presence in the room. But again, we're halfway through camp and he hasn't even suited up yet. So, and then do you let risk putting someone like Javarius Owens on waivers at that point? So we'll have to see. I think they would like to have a veteran safety guy. So Riley maybe still if he comes back from the concussion, which he should. So we'll have to see on safety. But yeah, it's
What's What's your thoughts on Isaiah Simmons? Obviously, he's a linebacker, but they're using him somewhat in more pass defense. How does he fit in this group? Where is his role?
he's having a better camp than I anticipated. So the thing with him is every team he's been with, the two teams he's been with, I should say, but different defensive coordinators, they don't really know what to do with him. So, and that was more so true in Arizona because they kept moving him all over the place because they couldn't figure out what to do with him. And Wink, the same kind of thing. Wink, sometimes he was part of the game plan, sometimes he wasn't. Um, he's been making a lot. He's been playing a lot with the first team, and he's been used in ways that I wouldn't have thought. They've had him in nickel, and the depth chart came out. And they have him as the backup nickel between Drew Phillips right now.
Right.
I've seen highlights where he's covering people like Wandale Robinson in practice from the nickel spot. And again, the size difference between the two of them is hilarious when you watch it, but he's not terrible at it. So I think he's going to have a much bigger role than I thought he was going to be. When I re-signed him, it wasn't right when free agency started. It wasn't even like the first week or so. It was like a couple or 2 or 3 weeks in, and it seemed like almost an afterthought. Now I'm starting to think he's going to have a big role in this team in a different number of ways. It is interesting. It seems to be more defensive back, but then you see times when he is used closer to the line of scrimmage. He again, we're going to talk about this in the other video, but he had a good practice against the Lions, and so I couple practice against the Lions. So I think he's going to be. I think he's a shoo-in on the 53, and I think he's going to have a big role on this team.
Yeah, he's kind of like Landon Collins in reverse. I mean, Collins was a safety, but they were kind of like, well, he's not really a safety after a while. So they started using him as like a nickel backer
Right.
in a way. And instead, this is the other way around. He's a linebacker, but you're kind of like, well, he's not really a linebacker because he doesn't, what's the old saying? He doesn't have a whole lot of lead in his pants. So he's not a big run defender. That's for sure. He's more coverage, but he's more athlete, and you're just trying to figure out how do we take advantage of the athlete versus the football player. I think he lacks somewhat of the football instincts, which is why he can't take that athleticism to the next step. But he's a better athlete than a lot of the people out there based on his height, size, overall. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see where he falls. Well, speaking of then moving to the backer side of things, thoughts overall, and we'll lump edge because
Yeah.
it's a whole different world now that we're in where we call edge and they're actually defensive. We'll lump them in with the linebackers at the moment. Thoughts on the linebackers? Let's start with the inside because a lot of people were one minute talking about Darian Beavers, and then later I see a depth chart. And again, I don't think they mean a whole lot, but all of a sudden his name was way back, and people were like, maybe he's not really going to be on this team. Thoughts on the inside backers?
Yeah, I don't know what to make out of Beavers. Again, he was playing with some first team reps early in camp, and now you don't hear much about him. So the depth chart might be right on him. The guy coming out of nowhere. There's a couple of players on this roster that were on the practice squad last year that no one really thought had much of a future, and now they look like they're going to have significant roles on this team. One's Ryder Anderson, who we'll discuss in a minute on the defensive line, and the other is Deontay Johnson, who he's been getting a lot of first team reps. He seems to be making plays when he's out there. You keep hearing mentioned, not just in run defense, but he had an interception. But then when you have somebody like Bobby Okereke speaking well of you, and he said he has the same physical profile that I do. Those types of comments catch your attention. So, what I think the interesting thing there is how much does the second linebacker play? Because Wink not Wink. Here we go. Um, Owen likes to play nickel and dime coverage, and usually you take the extra middle linebacker off the field. So if you do that, how much does Micah McFadden really play, or if it's Johnson or somebody else, how much does that guy play? Or is that when Simmons comes in to play that spot? Um, so I think Bobby is one of the better inside linebackers in this league. And I think it was noticeable. We had ever since Antonio Pierce left, we've had issues at inside
Yeah,
linebacker.
absolutely.
He's he he's the first guy who's come in here and we've said, okay, he's a guy. He's a guy that can do it all. He can blitz, he can cover, he can play the run. He stays healthy, we're in good shape there. It's the question is, who are the other guys? There are some guys who have special team, really standout special teams player like a Matthew Adams, who came over from the Browns, and Carter Coughlin, who's a good player with the Giants as a special teams player. I think they're competing directly against each other. I would think they would keep one of them, but then what do you do with the other spots, and how many defensive backs? I think they're going to keep a lot of defensive backs. And if you count Isaiah Simmons as a defensive back or a linebacker, that will skew that one way or the other. So I think Johnson's the guy that I'm really going to be watching in the preseason. He's the one who, and Beavers too. So those guys
Right.
are and I'm not discounting McFadden, and but he's got to tackle better. That's the one thing. He had a really good season last year. It would have been great, but he couldn't. But I think he led the team in missed tackles. You got to tackle, and that was my big negative on him.
Well, and I think, we heard it. We heard Dave Ball's, little shot about when he brought Bowen on about we got to get this run defense finally fixed and actually stop people. So you can't really have a guy out there who was on the field a lot and was a person who missed a lot of tackles. Certainly, a lot more of them were dragged down later on. So and then say he's just going to be your guy. He's going to be part of the new defense that's going to be able to stop. He's going to have to really prove that he can tackle. And he kind of played over his head to begin with. I mean, when we got McFadden, nobody was
Yes.
expecting,
Yeah.
the inside backer piece to me, it's weird because outside of Okereke, I mean, pretty much everybody else is just kind of like, eh. Like they're not really known. They're not well known. They're guys. So yeah, I think you're right. And Beavers is one. It's disappointing that I think how much of it was the injury. How much when he got hurt, he just didn't really come back from it the way you would have thought. But I mean, the drop off was significant. So maybe we were just so weak when he came on board that it seemed better in the beginning, but the fact that we've got a little bit more talent, he just can't get there. I don't know. So
Well,
we'll see.
yeah, and we'll have a different conversation based on the preseason games. So
Sure.
let's see how the preseason plays out. So Darius Masal may come out of someplace. Beavers may have a great game. We'll just have to see who does what in the preseason too, because these backup guys are going to play a lot.
Right.
So we'll find
Right.
out very quickly whether they're good or not. So we will have a different opinion in a week or two.
So with the edge guys, this is where it kind of gets a little exciting. Burns is clearly so far in camp, has been the guy we were expecting and hoping he would be. In fact, he's the guy that I think is really going to open things up for Thibodeau on the other side. I mean, you're not going to be able to shade one side versus the other. You're going to literally have to say we've got to man up on both, which also opens the middle. Now you got Lawrence. For once in the last, God, you'd have to go back to probably 2016. We're going to have a formidable four-man, if we want to, rush up there. When you have Lawrence on and you got Thibodeau, you got Burns, and then we can easily come in with, assuming he makes the team, and he should, Ojulari could be the fourth guy, or we just have another one of the D linemen. But we're going to be able to bring four that are going to be able to put pressure on people in a way that we haven't been able to do in a number of years without blitzing. These four guys should create a lot of havoc on their own.
Burns has so far looked to be the player they were hoping Thibodeau was going to be. So he's been, and this isn't a knock, it's a quasi knock on Thibodeau. He's been the best defensive player other than Dexter Lawrence on this team, and he's been everything and more so far that the Giants had hoped he would be. So again, I don't. We'll get into the Detroit in our third video game, but he dominated the Detroit practices. So he is the real deal as long as he keeps healthy. The thing I like about him is he's and this is something noticeable with this team overall is if they get dinged up in practice now, they're coming back and staying in practice. He rolled his ankle early on in
Right.
practice, and he still played and dominated the practice. There are other players like this too, like Illuminor really got hurt his ribs early in camp, and he shook it off and came back. There's been a number of players that have gotten dinged up, and you thought, well, he's going to be out for a few days. No, they're back the next practice or the same practice. And Burns is the real deal. I'm hoping Thibodeau takes another step forward and builds upon his season last year. And if he does, we're in really great shape with his frontline starters. The issue is depth. If one of those two guys get hurt, um, you're counting on Aziz, and then really, there's not much after that at all, unless
Right.
somebody. I mean, you're talking about no names before on the inside linebacker spot, but after Ojulari, then you're really getting to no names on the edge players, and that's the other spot other than corner. I could see them picking somebody up on the waiver wire because I don't see a fourth edge rusher here unless you're really into like Boogie Basham or somebody like that. I mean, there are guys there that I mean, there are guys there that are going to be on the practice squad, but I don't think you want them on the 53 man roster. So love the frontline starters at edge. Concerned about the depth. I think there were comments this week that they weren't sure that they would be able to do packages. I don't know if this came from a player or a coach. I think it was a player, but they weren't sure they would get Ojulari on the field with the other two guys. So that I think that's really going to be another defensive lineman that they're going to either get. Hopefully, somebody emerges this year, or they're going to have to get next year in the draft. But I think we're in really good shape as long as everyone stays healthy. The depth is the issue there.
Right. So on the interior of the line, we've got Lawrence. He's the guy. Next to him, there's a number of different people seem to really be, at least on the fan side of things, sour on Jordan Phillips being around, which I don't really understand because he's a veteran guy. I wouldn't expect much of anything from him in training camp. That Dayball and staff know what they're getting with the guy. They're either going to keep him or not keep him, and that was probably predetermined before anything, unless injury then decides it. He's just a guy who'll know what to do. He's not going to go all out in camp. I guarantee you that. But what are your thoughts on the rest of how that shakes out? Who else is going to be that guy that's going to play next to Lawrence? Because that seems to be somewhat in question.
This would be the spot that I'd normally be really concerned about, and I'm still kind of iffy on. But then Bowen comes out last week and says he loves the depth, and he says something. But we're going to be cutting people that can play in this league, and and he seems sincere about it, and that surprised me. So, and he's been around good defensive lines in Tennessee, so he knows what he's talking about. So what's interesting here is this is like you said, you've got Dexter, and I think they've got a lot of good nose tackle types that can play that can give Dexter a rest.
Right.
So you can have the Jordan Riley. I actually have my depth chart pulled up here because gotta look at all these different
Oh my
names we
God.
have
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you've got DJ Davidson and even somebody like Timmy Horn who came from Atlanta who's been making some plays this preseason. So you've got guys, they're not going to have a problem having a reserve behind Dexter that can give Dexter a breather. That's not the issue. The issue is who's going to be the three technique penetrator guy that attacks up the field and gets to the quarterback and can be disruptive. And that's where I thought they're going to have a real problem this offseason if they didn't get it in the draft and they didn't get it in free agency and they didn't. And when they start talking about Ryder Anderson, I was like, oh, dear Lord, but he's been getting first team reps. And like I
Right.
said, Bowen seems to be okay with that. They seem to have Nunez Roches now not doing nose tackle stuff so much, but over there. Now, if you see him line up in these tapes, he's a short guy. I mean,
Yeah.
you look at sometimes these heights and weights, and sometimes you wonder if they're accurate. He's even shorter to me than they got him listed at. He's a short guy. The guy, I hope this is a Cinderella story. The guy that keeps getting first team snaps was a tryout player, was Elijah Chapman, and
Right.
he was a rookie mini camp tryout player, which means he wasn't even signed to come to training camp. He was I don't know if fans remember this. Victor Cruz was in the same boat. When Victor Cruz wasn't signed for training camp, he came to training camp impressed, and then they signed him after training camp. Elijah Chapman's in that same category, that he impressed enough. He's tiny.
Yeah.
He's so
Yeah.
short, and but he's quick and disruptive, and I don't think you want him to start, but if you're looking for a pass rush package, he could be the guy that comes out of there. And then, like you said, no one's really talking about Jordan Phillips, and right now they got him listed. So right now on the unofficial depth chart, official but unofficial depth chart,
Right.
at that position opposite of Lawrence, they've got Nunez Roches #1, Ryder Anderson #2, Jordan Phillips 3, and Elijah Chapman 4. But Chapman's been getting first team reps. Anderson's been getting first team reps, and Nunez Roches has been getting first team reps. We haven't heard too much out of Phillips. Like you said, he's a vet, doesn't need a lot of time. Well, that'll be interesting. I don't know. I'd like to know if he's going to play in the preseason or not. We'll find out tonight. And the guy you're not hearing anything about that looked like a good free agent signing, rookie free agent signing, is Casey Rogers. We're not hearing anything about him.
Mm.
So I'd be, if Bowen didn't say what he said, I'd be more worried. I'm still not really completely comfortable. I think they still need a guy there, but that they seem to be more nervous about corner than they are on the defensive line right now.
Yeah, it's interesting because I mean we use the term nose tackle. I think they look at some of the backup noses to basically be the other DN that they're going to use. So when they say we can cut people, you named them already. I mean, if you go in three deep, if Davidson's your third, he's a guy who's physically shown he can play in his league. He got injured. He's a young guy, but he's got talent. He's physically capable. Somebody would pick him up at some point. You big guys are kind of hard to find. We've got him. We got Riley, which we didn't really talk about him either. Jordan Phillips. These guys they can play. I don't think we have a guy though that can be we don't have another guy who could actually pass rush from the D line position outside of Lawrence. I think the other guys, and maybe that smaller guy, but we don't have an all around guy that I would feel comfortable
Right.
being like, yeah.
That's my concern is, I mean, look, Riley and Davidson aren't likely to be that kind of guy.
Right.
They could surprise us, but they're not likely to be that. When I say that kind of guy, I mean a defensive lineman who can get 8 sacks a year. Okay. That's not their game. Ryder Anderson, I have a hard time, but again, he's getting first team rep. I have a hard time seeing. I saw some reps with him on the one-on-one matchups, and he just got stonewalled. But then you read some other comments and say Ryder did pretty well in those one-on-ones. I'm not watching the same things that they're watching. So Jordan Phillips. So this is where I'm at. They're going. This is kind of what Bowen was going to get at. When I look at who they've got and who's playing, they're going to have to cut somebody here who we're talking about. So they
Right.
can't keep Lawrence, Riley, Davidson, Nunez, Roches, Anderson, Phillips, and Chapman. That's 7. They can't keep that many. They could, but I don't think they're going to do that.
Right.
So somebody there's got to go. Do they cut somebody like Chapman and risk him for the practice squad? I don't know. Remember, they're going to be scrimmaging practices against the Jets too, and they already did the Lions. And so teams are getting up close looks at these guys, and so it's going to be harder to sneak people through. And then we're doing the same thing with the Lions and the Jets.
Sure.
We're going to be
Absolutely.
looking at their players, and so I wouldn't be, when the Lions and the Jets start cutting people, I wouldn't be surprised if we pick up one of their players. Let's put it that way. So somebody's got to go who's playing a lot now in practice with the first and second team. I just don't know who it's going to be right now. Do they cut somebody like DJ Davidson? I don't think so, but they might. I just don't. I don't know how this is going to play out. And again, the preseason will be telling. That to me, that this is one of the more interesting groups, because what we're being told, I'm not sure I believe yet. So they
Right.
say this is a good group. I'm not sure I believe that yet. Again, the nose tackle, run defender kind of guys. Yeah, I don't know where the pass rush is coming other than Dexter, like you just said.
Yeah. So I agree. And with that in mind, let's wrap up
Wrap
this
this up.
the
Yeah.
training camp portion here real quick then. Of the position groups that we have, or even just individual players, where do you see us with, having to make tougher decisions, not in, geez, who are we going to keep, but it's almost like, geez, who are we going to get rid of? And I'll go first, and I'll say, to me, it's wide receiver right away. You can see it a little top heavy, and then, but we have some veterans. McKenzie, you got Robinson. They didn't bring him over just because they were being nice and wanted just a vet guy to run stuff. He's physically different than a lot of the other receivers that we have. He brings a different thing to the table. You also have, then you've got a guy like Wheaton coming off his injury last year, but he's got a lot of special teams upside to him. He can play special teams, he can tackle, he could be a gunner, but he also showed some receiving skills and a size thing that we don't have with a lot of the other receivers that we have. So I think wide receiver is that portion for me, and I think the interior of the D line is going to be where that's going to be a tougher place to cut down in terms of who are we keeping and who are we actually going to let go. What about you?
Yeah, I'm looking at the entire depth chart again. If people are wondering why I'm looking down, wide receiver stands out. I mean, clearly wide receiver is to me is the number one group. Is they're going to be cutting some players that are going to be able to play in this league. I'll give you an example. Isaiah McKenzie can be a really good gadget player in this league, and it would be a really good backup for Wandale if Wandale got nicked up or hurt. And he also can be a returner, but he's competing directly against Gunner for the return job. So I think one of two of those guys is going to make it. And then there's just some very interesting wide receivers on this. Like we haven't talked really about Allen Robinson that much, but he's been having a good camp. And I could go through all of these wide receivers. There's some guys that are just going to make the practice squad that they don't have to worry about. Like maybe like a John Giles
Right.
will make. Who's been having a really decent camp is Dennis Houston. No one's been talking about him. And Miles Boykins was a stud gunner in this league, and I love punt gunners that kick butt because the Giants have a history of that, and when we have them, they do affect the outcome of games. So is your fifth wide receiver really more valuable than somebody that as a pure wide receiver than Miles Boykin? I don't know. So the wide receiver spot really stands out. I like you said earlier, we were discussing. I think there's some interesting. Who do you keep at inside linebacker, and then the defensive line gets interesting. But I don't know if that's a talent thing. Yeah, that might be. I'll have to see it to believe it to see the defensive line is stronger than we thought. I will tell you, last thing, there are going to be some tough decisions at safety, looking at the safety
Mm.
group, because do you keep the veteran Jalen Mills and Riley, or do you look at somebody like Javarius Owens? Alex Johnson's a rookie free agent who's made a few plays. He's probably practice squad bound in my opinion. But I don't know if they're going to keep five safeties. So at some point you have to determine which of those groups go. And there are a couple of vets in there I think they'd like to keep, but then you want to, Pinnock, Belton, and Newman are going to make it. Then what do you do with Owens, Riley, and Mills? So you're not going to keep six. Do you keep four? Do you keep five? So that's going to be tough.
Yeah, and I would say a couple of guys that these games are going to be super important. Marcus McKeithian at this point is way, way
Oh, I think
down.
he's gone.
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't.
it's too bad too, because I mean he showed promise and then he got hurt, and you want those lower round draft pick guys, especially on the O line, because we need to you got to balance your salary cap out. We can't every year go sign free agents. You're just eating up so much cap space in a positional group. You want those guys from a lower pick, even free agent guys, to come on board to fill your depth. And he was a guy, and then I think Azudu as well, even though he's the backup swing tackle. If he doesn't show enough in games, I think we can go and find another vet tackle on the waiver wire to replace him.
Well, he's key now because he's the swing tackle. Right now, he's the swing tackle because Neal's not there.
Right.
I thought that the guy that got from Detroit, Nelson, was going to be more, but he seems to be buried on the depth chart. McKeithen's buried on the depth chart. But what gives you, you can afford, I mean, again, he was a lower round draft pick. You can afford to, again, have misses on them if you can replace them with somebody like, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, Kubas, the guard that they
Yeah,
got out
yeah,
of. You know, he seems to be higher up on the depth chart. So if he pans out, somebody like letting McKeithen go, that's okay. And then, so there are a lot of guys on the offensive line that the preseason is going to be really, really, really important for. I mean, they can make or break them, and McKeithen's one of them. You know, again, if somebody looks terrible that they were counting on, and he plays well, then he's going to get look with fresh eyes. But it's kind of telling to me that he's kind of buried on the depth chart, not just on their official depth chart, but in the lists when you see the reporters reporting on who's with the second and third teams, he's not there with the second team. You know,
right, right,
that's
right.
not a good sign for him.
So I would say we've covered camp so far, kind of the positional battles, where the roster's at for this video. So before we'll do one more coming up with the joint practice with the Lions, kind of what happened there, and that's kind of like a $200,000 discussion. And then we'll do the game preview, which is later tonight. So if you can like, subscribe, we really appreciate that. And for Eric and myself, thanks for joining us on Inside BBI with John and Eric, and we'll be back with more videos very soon.